In the land of Israel, this Hebrew year is being observed as a Shemitah year, as the once in 7 years sabbatical described in this Shabbat's Torah portion, Parashat Behar. The primary requirement of a sabbatical year is that the fields in the land of Israel are to lie fallow or untended. The crops that grow naturally are considered ownerless and quasi-sacred. Another lesser-known feature is the cancellation, the nullification, of most interpersonal debt at the end of each Shemitah year, at the culmination of each 7-year cycle. But by the 1st century before the Common Era, the great sage Hillel noticed that poor people had trouble securing much-needed loans as the sabbatical year approached. Their would-be creditors knew all too well that they would likely not collect on their debts before they were nullified by the coming sabbatical year. But without access to these loans, the impoverished were trapped within their poverty, unable to meet their pressing needs, or without the funds to launch new initiatives that would rise them out of poverty. Hillel solved this dilemma by developing a new legal mechanism known as the prusbul, which circumvented the biblical law in a way that allowed these debts to be collected even after the sabbatical year concluded. Ironically, by making the debts of the less fortunate more enforceable, Hillel actually improved their lot by ensuring that they would be able to obtain the capital they needed to improve their lives. The late anthropologist David Graeber noted in his much-discussed book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, that while we are conditioned to understand that paying one's debts, that living up to one's responsibilities is foundational to what morality is all about, this is actually not always the case. He cites the example of the Canadian naturalist Ernest Thompson Seton, a pivotal figure in the creation of the Boy Scouts, who was known to have had a difficult relationship with his father, to the point where he turned 21, his father actually presented him with a detailed record containing all of the expenses connected with Ernest's childhood, beginning with the fee charged by the doctor who delivered him. It came out to $537.80 in 1881 dollars, interest accrued at 6% annually. Seton paid the bill, but then never spoke to his father again. Analyzing this story, the author Margaret Atwood considered how squaring accounts means that parties have the ability to walk away from each other. So by presenting his parental relationship to his son as a bill, his father was demonstrating his own preference to be disconnected, to be squared away from that relationship. Atwood concludes, and I quote, "While most of us can imagine what we owe to our parents as a kind of debt, few of us can imagine being able to pay it, or even that such a debt ever should be paid." End quote. Graeber's point is that although they are often couched in the same language, debts and obligations are not the same thing. Debts are precisely quantified, which allows them to become impersonal, even transferable. Nowadays, you could even buy and sell them. On the other hand, obligations are much harder to extricate from their original contexts. Obligations reflect interpersonal relationships. In many ways, the interlocking networks of obligations we all owe to each other are actually what make up the maps of our families and our communities. We don't expect to pay back these obligations, even if we have the ability to do so. Instead, we appreciate how these connections to others give our lives depth, how they give our lives meaning. Our world is fueled by debt, not obligation. Consumer debt, medical debt, mortgage debt, student debt are all at all-time highs. Yet at the same time, people feel ever more distant and isolated from each other. Hillel was wise enough to realize when the world needed more debt, a little less obligation. We might consider what it would mean to have the wisdom to move in the other direction. Shabbat Shalom.